think that one of the most exciting moments in debate is the moment the timer first starts and the first words in 1AC are particularly true when it's a new app and nobody knows exactly what it's going to be. The room's full, it's hot, it smells like goats, but we're in there and we're going to do it together kind of thing. I love that moment in debate. I'm going to talk about the 1AC in terms of sort of a process instead of just giving the speech. I'm going to talk about 3 parts of the process. Researching it and sort of what I look for strategically in a good affirmative, what it takes to win, sort of the things that you do as you're building the affirmative to stymie the negative and make it more difficult for them. I'm going to talk a little bit about writing it, like what a good 1AC looks like, what it contains, maybe what it doesn't contain, what you should be thinking about as you do it. And finally, I'm going to talk about the bastard stepsister of all these things, which is the delivery part of it. A lot of times we sort of treat the 1AC as this canned, rote speech that we kind of get up and we fly through in 8 minutes as quickly as we can. We don't really want to talk what we're saying. We just want to get to the rest of the debate. Like the debate starts somewhere after the 2AC. And nothing bothers me more, and I hate to hear it. I hate to think to high school students, young debaters who are really learning what it takes to be excellent at the next level, think about the 1AC that way. So we're going to talk about researching it, writing it, and a little bit on delivery. All right, so I start the process of researching, and the kids in my lab sort of saw us go through this. One of the very first things I look for in general, I never start cutting cards right away. I got to read a little bit before I have any idea what a good app is going to be. And one of the things I'm looking for as I start the process of reading is depth of literature and a strong literature base, like well-written literature. Lots of times ideas are good ones, but not yet very well formulated. You might read a bunch of articles in sort of newspaper, hobby kind of journal, even decent ones, like I said, The Economist or something like that. You're finding articles about a particular idea, but it's not very well thought out yet. I'm looking for places where policy think tanks are starting to write new work. Are there book chapters written about it? Is there a lot being written about a particular area? I'll give away sort of one of the things I think about apps in general is my own personal bias, but sustainability really matters to me. I want an affirmative where I can read it the whole year. I can dig in on a particular area and know more than anybody else in the country about that particular thing. Think about what the negatives have to do when they research, right? They've got to cover all those different apps and ideas. They approach it primarily, 60% of the time, even at 70% of the time, even at the highest levels of high school and college debate, generically. They have generic strategies they attempt to adapt. Now, if you're smart about the app and you're looking for areas where there's really well-written stuff by really qualified people that are doing a good job of explaining their ideas, then you can dig into that area and have a much broader set of answers. They're going to be doing something generic, but every time when you innovate, it's going to be something more specific, more difficult for them to answer and to adapt to. And so, right off the bat, is it well written? Are people PhDs talking about it? Are there lots of articles about it overall? And is the quality of the writing good? Steer away, as I said, from like pop journalism if you can, and start to look for things that are actual strong policy think tanks. If the Cato Institute's writing about something, just for example, there's a decent chance that there's more in that area than just a couple random articles you found on Google News or something like that. Something else I'm looking for, and I think this is often overlooked by people as they're shopping kind of for their app process, is an affirmative bias in the literature. Is change in your particular area a good idea? Do people say that we should? I mean, you'll always find kind of cards that are like, we should do something different. There are lots of people writing about that. Is the direction of the literature one that says that there's a discrete problem that we should be solving and that the app could potentially do something about it? So affirmative bias overall. If you start searching, I've seen kids do this all the time. People I've coached at high school and college level do this. They get really excited about an impact. They get really excited about an idea. Like, I want to talk about, it doesn't matter. None of what I'm saying is disparaging anybody's app. Let's just say you went into the topic saying, I only want to talk about high-speed rail. I'm really into high-speed rail. I saw that episode of Simpsons about the monorail, thought that sounded tight, and I'm all in, right? And so people kind of get a little bit of tunnel vision with that. Before you make a decision about anything particular, figure out if there are more articles than negative. If you Google something, and let's start with the most basic kind of search. You Google something, and the first 3 or 4 pages are primarily articles that say something's not a great idea, and you probably got an idea that the literature in that area is skewing a little bit towards the negative. The idea for you, as you're approaching all this, is to put the negative behind the 8 ball. You want to have way more literature about what we should do, about why we should do the plan than why we should. Just generally have an affirmative bias. Now, I said that sometimes ideas aren't fully formed yet. Literature takes a little while to catch up. Policy think tanks may suggest something, and that idea may get put to bed, or there may not be a lot of writing about it. So another thing I'm looking for specifically, right away, is are there specific solvency aspects? Are there cards by qualified folks that actually say to do something around which you could potentially write a plan and have a solvent affirmative? Again, lots of times people get real wrapped up in the impacts. They say, I want to debate heads, or I want to debate the economy, or whatever else. But they forget to ask themselves the question, can I solve that stuff? It doesn't really matter how cool your impact is or how big it is if you can't solve it. That's a 2AR you're going to lose most of the time. You know, it sounds great to plan, it sounds great that you've got a large head today, 25 different scenarios, but if you can't access them, I don't understand why you would really care about that. So looking for strong, specific solvency applicants that describe a specific course of action and one that is generally defensible. Now, of course, all the things I'm saying about the app are pretty generic. I'm not going to zoom in too much on particular policies and which one I think are good or bad. Feel free to ask me about that during question and answer time or something, but this is my approach. Also, as I said already, sustainability. I like this app to be something I can read the entire year long. It's not just the dance with the one that brought you kind of thing. But one of the things about having an app you can read all year long is that not only do you get deep on it, it provides you lots of options. So let's say high-speed rail is your thing, but there might be multiple different ways that could be implemented. And as you start to do quality solvency research, you'll figure that out. That I can read my high-speed rail app, mechanism A for a little while, and when people kind of catch up to that, we're already ahead. We're going to shift to mechanism B, mechanism C, so on and so forth. Also, sustainability is looking for an internal link pool of unique things to say. What are some of the basic impact areas on this topic? Everybody's app the first week is going to have what couple kind of things?
Economy.
Nuclear war is not an advantage, it's an impact. Oil dependency, economy, hegemony, right? So one of the things I'm looking for is, while it's great to be able to access those things that everybody else's app is going to access, guess what? If you're that predictable, and that's as much thought as you put into it, it's pretty easy to take simple generic strategies to beat them. I can have a counterplan to counterplan out of those hedge stuff. I can have alternate counterplans where I don't even have to engage the solvency of the app to do something about the economy. I can impact turn any one of those arguments and be fairly ready on the negative. So as I'm looking and I'm thinking about sustainability, if there's a huge literature base, and a lot of people, like smart people, are writing about it, you're going to find internal links to more interesting ideas that are not as easily impact printable or not as easily predictable by the negative. So dig in early, look for something that's sustainable that you can read. I mean, you may not want to read something all year long, and you kind of decide on your own circuit like what's best for you. It's always good to have new apps, but if you can take one area and kind of spin it, riff on it the entire season, you can always go back to something that's friendly, that's home, that has a strong set of advantages that you can be more ready to debate than anybody else. So that, plus kind of unique harms and advantage areas, really help you sort of spread the negative out, and that is your goal overall, is to make the negative hard. Not just the negative in the round hard. Will they have a sweet strategy day one of the first tournament? Hey, in the front, wake up. There you go. And not just will they have a sweet strategy in the first tournament, but will it be difficult for the negative to research that the entire year? So sustainable apps, strong advocates, really good literature makes that much harder for the negative. And the last thing, well not last thing, but one of the other things I recommend to people as a sort of internalize this approach and try and do it is to source them. As you all have done the research in the last week and a half or so of camp, we've come up with a lot of different things. We found a lot of smart stuff. We found a lot of think tanks and authors who advocate particular ideas. There's this guy named Craig Burrows, may he rest in peace. We learned recently that he just died. That's quite sad. But Craig Burrows, he writes a lot about this Bering Strait tunnel, right? So while we found a couple articles from an institute that he worked for, quickly Googling his name found out, led us to discover that he'd written about 10 articles about it, and then a book about it. So we exhausted that before we did it. As we found think tanks that tended to have cards about what we were writing about, we mined the entire think tank before we moved on to someplace else. This is vitally important to do. You don't want to miss things. Part of digging in and having a sustainable affirmative and being able to really debate it the entire year and have something that's going to win and be effective all year long is going to require that you know all the ins and outs, all the places that people can write about it, etc., etc. It'll also help you. If you're very methodical about this, it'll help you figure out what the negative is going to say. And as important as anything you're going to do when you have research, as important as it is to have good solvency advocates and strong internal links and good advantages, etc., none of that gets you anywhere if you are not able to adequately predict what the negative is going to say. And so a big part of being affirmative is thinking like the negative. What will they say against us, and what will I need to include in my app? Where do I need to take the research to make negatives strategies harder for them to win overall? So you're looking for depth and quality of writing, a strong affirmative bias, specific solvency advocates, something that's sustainable, good harms areas that you find interesting, and when you find those things, mine those sources all the way out to the end. One more thing about source finding is that you'll find, and you already know this, that think tanks tend to have a particular ideology. If the ideology is one that agrees with your affirmatives, then probably there's lots of articles in that particular source about your stuff. If you find think tanks that are politically and ideologically opposed to that idea, you know that's where negatives are going to go, and you can kind of target it and hone that stuff right away. Now, I kind of already hinted at the second part of this, but I remember as a freshman in college getting a lecture from my head coach then about the importance. I cut a pretty good app, I felt pretty good about it. I rolled into the squad meeting, I was excited to show everybody. He flipped through it and he's like, solid, what are we going to say against it? And I was like, this app. He's like, you're an idiot, go away, cut the negative. And that's my advice to you. Do not put off cutting the negative. You got to be negative sometimes. First of all, as brilliant as you all are, whatever ideas you've had, somebody else is going to have them as well. If you think you've got a good app, then you need to cut. You can bet your biddy that somebody else is going to have the same app idea or something close enough to it, and you're going to make sure you have the negative. So make sure that all the things you can think of, the disadd links, the counterplan links, the K links, all the kind of angles from which the affirmative can be attacked are also researched by you. To be ahead on the affirmative also means to be ahead on the negative in that same way. So you got to have that stuff. You'll also find lots of neg authors, like people who consistently write against your plan. Those authors are useful search terms for you, because the people who advocate your plan will answer that stuff in a very direct way often. And so you want to make sure you Google their names and do enough research that you're comfortable in the direction the negative can take it. You got to always assume you aren't the only person who's thought of your app. It will definitely help you prepare in the process of writing the 1AC itself, the process of writing your 2ACs, and just understanding the entirety of the debate that surrounds your app requires you to have spent as much time on the negative as you have the affirmative. Now we all know that we get excited about the app, we do one thing, and sort of shuffle the negative arguments away, and as all the files are coming out this week, we see a little bit of that, right? The negs aren't as large as the app and so on and so forth. It's always been our goal, and it's been very effective for us as in high school and college as a debater and as a coach to make sure that we knew more about the neg than the neg possibly knew about the app. We've had success there have been times, even last year, where teams that had a similar app to ours would not read it against us because they knew that we probably had more to say on the neg than we. So preparation of the negative is just as important. Preparation of what the negative can say is just as important. And the last thing I'll say about being negative or being prepared to be negative is you have to have practice debates against your app that mean something. When you're at home, with your coaches, with other teams, whether you're doing them on your own, or supervised, or whatever else, you want to make sure that the practice debates you have are extremely effective. So the best possible strategies that are so good you don't think anybody else would find them, that are so obscure that you don't imagine anybody else would ever read them against you. That's awesome. That's like swinging two bats to get ready to get up to the plate. When you drop down to this one, it feels that much lighter. You're quicker for the zone, right? So you want to make sure you know that stuff. Actually, Louie and I debated one time in college and had a debate, and they'd broken a new app against us. It turned out to be the same app that we were planning to break in the next debate, or later that tournament. And lucky for us, we've done a whole bunch of work on the negative for it, and it helped us a lot. So we weren't surprised by the new app. We're more prepared as well, which is a pretty good example of how you kind of set that stuff up. The negative facilitates the affirmative. Don't forget about it. Don't blow it off. Don't shuffle it off to somebody else. It's your responsibility affirmative. You got to do this. Next thing I want to say is that you're approaching all this, and say you've got 2 or 3 good ideas, and you're not sure what's up, think about it strategically. There are certain sets of arguments that are going to pop up in every set of debates. The same way we said there are stable advantage pools like hedge and econ and oil dependency, there's stable negative arguments as well. States counterplan is going to be pretty good on this. What are some other ones? Well, China counterplan is probably okay. There's a bunch of things that you can kind of predict from your experience in camp and your research that are going to be big deals. So the question you have to ask yourself before you make a final decision is my app strategic? Is it offensive against those things, whatever they may be? If you know the state's counterplan is a slayer to about 60% of the apps, you want to make sure that you're in the 40% that it can't hurt. If you know that there's a strong economy disadd on this topic to almost everything, because most plans spend billions of dollars, then be sure that your app can control the uniqueness of the economic model. But you have to think strategically about what the negative arguments are. I can't stress enough how important the negative is.
Ask yourself questions like, I just said, can you control the uniqueness on the meta issues, hegemony, oil movements, econ, whatever else those things might be. And when I say control the uniqueness, that is to say the actors that have inevitability things about those things. If not for the plan, the economy is doomed. If not for the plan, U.S. hegemony is doomed. If not for the plan, terrorism is inevitable, whatever else, right? Because if you are in control of that direction, the meta uniqueness questions, all those things from the 1AC on, your 2AR, 1AR is going to be a lot easier. There's less that you have to win to be offensive in this case. Other thing to ask yourself, this is still kind of getting back to the point of often people get excited about advantages before they ask themselves whether or not they can solve them, is the action the plan takes necessary and sufficient to solve? Sir, it might be sufficient, but if it's only sufficient, you're going to have a hard time answering counterclaims, right? There's going to be a lot of advantage counterclaims to deal with your app. The question is your app the one and only thing you can do, or can you reasonably argue that it's the most important step we can take to resolve the internal link to any of the impacts of your group? And if that's the case, you're probably in a good place. And one of the last things I try to think about, and again getting back to the idea of sustainability, is have I picked an area where I can have multiple versions? I bet most of you debate on circuits where you're going to, in 6 rounds in a high school tournament, 3 or 4 of them might be policy, or 3 or 4 of them might be K. You're going to have to go back and forth between those two things. Having one app try and deal with all of that is probably not the most strategic place for the affirmative to be. Although you don't want to have to do something totally off the reservation every time you debate a K group. So one of the things you should ask yourself is, does my app allow me to sort of swing far left if I have to, and swing further right if I want to, and give me some latitude? So looking at it and saying there are multiple versions of this, so that accesses internal links that might both be about oppression and also about Russian relations, right? There are ways to do that. Are there impact scenarios that I can read that complicate alternatives, and so on and so forth? So a broad range of things, not just in the policy range, but also in the kind of K range as well. Or maybe the other thing to think about is there decent literature that defends my app versus the K, right? Are there reasons why research or knowledge about a particular area of public policy is vital to making the K alt better, so you've got kind of perm answers or whatever else. But don't think about it one-dimensionally. You have to think about it from all the different things that negatives do. That's why I think having a good, broad, deep app really helps you. So think strategically about this. All right, I want to talk a little bit about writing the app. I'll do this pretty quickly because some of the stuff, I usually have a longer version of this, but in 20 minutes we're going to get through it pretty quick. The construction of advantages overall. There's a lot of different theories on how to kind of do this stuff, but I really believe in 3 Fs. I think the 1AC is a toolbox for the 2AC. In fact, the 1AC is really the first iteration of your 2AC. If you're reading cards in your 1AC that you are not extending in the 2AC in most debates, then you should probably start to ask yourself questions about why those cards are in the 1AC. Or, for example, you might have slightly different versions of advantages or solvency or whatever else, depending on the kind of team you read or what they're going to say against you. You might know some team in your district that's good, you guys meet in your high round all the time, and you know the sort of strategies they like to go for, then you should tweak the 1AC. Lots of times, especially among young debaters, it's very understandable. It really attaches the arguments in the 1AC. You get really comfortable with it. What every card says, I can read it backwards, but at the end of the day, that's underutilizing the 8 minutes you've got to read. So don't get too attached to anything. If you're not extending it, it's probably not valuable. There's also lots of times the topic, as you know, evolves. And so stuff that was really important, it seemed like in the first 2 or 3 weekends of the season, are probably not going to be as important later. Like round robins, for example, lots of people will break these strategies that will sort of evolve the topic. We get a little bit of a break over Christmas, and people catch up on research, the topic evolves again. So what you need to have in the 1AC will change, and you just need to be flexible enough to understand that. So make sure in the 1AC, I usually say if the average is 6 to 8 cards in an advantage, I would say it takes 3 to 4 cards usually to establish your advantage and an impact. And then other things I would read in the advantage you're going to are preempt and common negative arguments. You should, as I said, be fluid with those things. If the arguments change what you've got in your 1AC. Another good rule is if you can't defend it, don't read it. Do not hang impacts from negative. If you've got a 25-page hedge good file, and you've got a hedge advantage in the 1AC, you're cruising, right? You get beat up on. Someone's going to impact turn that. It's going to be really embarrassing 2AR for you. We used to have a 50-page file, a 50-page rule. If we read an impact in the 1AC, we needed at least 50 pages of impact terms to deal with it. 50 pages of the impact. To make sure that we could handle the negative block going for impact terms. So generally, if you can't defend it, if you're not sure about it, research it, know what the negative can say, and don't read it until you're positive you can. Yeah?
What is that already made you want to see who's like or something?
Say what?
What is that an app that's already made me? Like, what do you see then?
An app is already an app somebody else. Right?
Yeah, like.
And you're taking it over.
Yeah, do you still research it? Like.
Yeah, you never stop researching it. The app is an organic thing. The 1AC, the process, you never stop researching it. It's never done. And the way I think about this is somewhere out there is a negative who wants to beat me, and I don't want that to happen. They can't catch up. Never let them catch up, right? You know more than they do about it always. Just keep going. So if you can't defend it, don't read it. If it's someone else's app, like Victoria just said, then pick it up and figure out what you need to make it your app. Making it, using the app in your voice, and I'll talk about this in a second, is very important thing. Can you control uniqueness? I kind of already talked about that. You need to anticipate counterplans as well. Not just counterplans that deal with just your solvency mechanism, but counterplans that might interact with the internal link to the advantages. What internal link stories do I want to include that make it difficult for counterplans to counterplan out? You want to make sure that the internal link to the impact is intrinsic to the actually app. That's more about necessary and sufficient business. And like I said, the average length I think of advantage is a good solid advantage that's defended. It's probably got some preempts against common negative arguments and counterplans. It's about 6 to 8 cards, but you all know how fast you are, and you know your circuit, you know what you can get away with. And so be fluid with that. Just be thinking that the advantage needs to defend itself. You don't want the negative to be. If a good rule I look at is if the negative reads their 2 minutes, say, of case arguments to your advantage, you should be able to get through those arguments in about 45 seconds without reading any evidence, because you've already answered it in one AC. If you got to read one card, maybe they surprised you, that's a better place to be. But if people are commonly reading case arguments, and you're saying to yourself, wow, every 2 AC I have to read 3 new cards, A sub point, those cards should just find a way into the 1 AC so you can stop doing that. And B sub point, you're not being very strategic in the way you approach your 1 AC. All right, so solvency. I always say the more specific, the better. Don't settle for crappy solvency cards. Don't settle for generic things. You want to make sure you read evidence for specific advantages and internal links. One of the things that I like to do in general with solvency is embed it in the advantage itself, or at least one card that indicates the plan to resolve the internal link or the pool of internal links, so that my solvency contention isn't burdened with a bunch of cards that say we should do the plan, but rather is offensive towards counterplans and other things there. So try to make sure you have evidence for each specific internal link. For example, with our Arctic app, we had to go back, because we have a lot of Russia relations advantages, we had to go back and make sure that we found solvency cards that were specific to what the plan would do for U.S.-Russia relations. We put one of those in each advantage for the exact kind of argument and scenario we were talking about. And you got to use the solvency for the template for the plan. Lots of times I used to make fun of these, I used to give these kids a hard time, but there's always like the plan person in your lab, the plan person who shows up at the camp with like a notebook, piece of notebook paper with like 25 plans written on it. And you're like, where's the evidence for that? And they're like, I'll find the evidence. Whoops, no, reverse that process. Find the evidence first and then write the plan on it, which is why I want to talk a little bit about planning. There's a couple different schools of thought on this, and I'm just going to give you mine, but sometimes people like to write these long, sprawling plans because they think it makes it difficult for you to counterplan on it. It takes them, 45 seconds to read their plan, and you're trying to pick out, it's going to take you maybe a minute to read the plan back. I guess it's sort of time trade-off, and I find that foolish. To me, the simpler the plan is, the better. The formula I was always taught, and the one I live by as a coach, is the minimum action for maximum impact. The least you can do. The one-sentence plan, way better than the long, sprawling plan. I'll explain why in the book. Bring it on. I like my 2 AR versus the 2 AR going for vagueness. Let's do that. Right. A-spec's not, you can win on A-spec. I don't want to make fun of any A-spec debaters, Wait, I do. It's not a very good argument. And that's exactly the kind of strategic thinking. I would rather have them going for vagueness in the 2 R than them going for a counterplan that picked out of something I couldn't do. Make sense? So if you're balancing the risk there, I think it's better. One reason is pick links. Picks are awesome. Negative gets a lot of them. Most judges find them to be acceptable. And if you've got the more stuff you have in the plan, the more you have to defend. Now, you saw a K-framework debates the other day where like the part of the 2AC the framework was there's tons of different representations we could never compare. You know what's more compelling? I would call this a hack. You know what's more compelling than that? You put it in your plan, so defend it, right? And most judges on either side of the spectrum are going to find that to be true. The more things you put in the plan, the more opportunities are for links to disads. Good 2 and C's are going to spin all the different actions of the plan and find a way to make that an elections link, or an economy link, or a Russian link, or whatever else. And so give them less to work with. Also, because being affirmative is awesome and we get to say kind of whatever we want in talk class, a little bit of vagueness in the plan gives you flexibility to maneuver what the plan does in the 2AC versus an alternative, versus a counterpart, versus anything else. I'm not saying be vague and abusive. I'm saying give yourself room to move. Simple is better. The less you have to have, the better. Start with the evidence. Do what your advocates recommend. Victoria, what's up? Okay. Don't apologize for asking questions.
But then, like, what if you're putting like a little bit of basic and complicate yourself because of that basic?
Don't do that.
So how do you
Also, don't. I swear to God, I don't understand the question. Like, if the plan is vague and contradicts yourself, you need to have an affirmative story about kind of everything. If you know the ways you can spin your plan, that story should make sense to you in your head and you should be able to say. Start with evidence. Do what your advocates recommend. Try not to do more than they recommend or less than they recommend. Be specific about actors and mechanisms only if there is a specific advantage to it. There is no way I would have a 1AC that said anything besides the USFG should and the thing we're going to do. I wouldn't recommend an agency or anything like that unless I was damn sure that if they picked out of the agency, I would read multiple dissents. Unless it's absolutely sufficient and necessary to solve your app, I would not include such things. Like I said, most people don't find ASPEC to be a particularly compelling argument. Take your chances there over a counterclaim that 100% competes because they picked out of something you're, again, you're not making prepared to defend. And obviously, everything in the plan should be something you can defend. The representation of it, the mechanism of it, the function of it, etc. All those things need to be things that you can defend. And I don't mean defend like, oh, it's kind of good. I mean, you need to disadd to a counterplan that takes it out. Offense, an impact to something. That's got to happen. Otherwise, you're going to lose the pixel. All right, so I want to talk a little bit about delivery. I'm going a little long here, so I won't talk too long about it. But there's this tendency, and you see high school and college, there's this tendency for people to sort of blow through the 1AC. It's this pro forma thing. They've given it hundreds of times, and they're bored with it. Please, please, please don't treat your 1AC like that. You cannot bunt your way through a 1AC. Speaker points matter. All of you want speaker awards. That's one reason speaker points matter. Let me give you a better reason speaker points matter. You know how tournaments are paired? After your presets, high-lows are how they're paired. So if you're in a 3-1 bracket, the higher your speaker points are, the lower the speaker points of the next team you're debating. Good speaker points matter. You win more debates the higher you are in the bracket. This is just a fact. If your speaker points are higher, you're going to get easier draws throughout the tournament. Sure, your high may suck. We'll take that. But the high-lows make it easier for you to have a higher seeding in the tournament, and that's what we want, right? And so speaking clearly, speaking well in the 1AC is absolutely right. What's up, Roger?
You sound like you should have a little bit.
Yes. Yes. There is nothing worse than slogging through somebody's 1AC where they randomly throw papers and mumble into a computer. I hate it. Judges hate it. Congratulations on your 27.5, right? Or you can get that 28.5 because the 1AC was compelling to me and the 1AR was awesome, and now we're off to the races. We're in a much better spot. It's important, though, and Victoria kind of brought this point up. What happens when you pick up somebody else's app? Often on squad, somebody else's app happens. You have to find your own voice in your affirmative. Rewrite it so that it makes sense to you. If you're funny, make it kind of funny. If you're faster, find a way to be clear and fast and distinct as you do it. If you're a slower debater, then make that work for you. But your own voice matters so much, and judges recognize this. As much as we talk about the technique of debate, at the end of the day, it is still a game of persuasion. So persuade people. Be compelling. It can be done. CX really matters. Knowing your 1AC, it is painful to watch the reader 1AC and watch the cross-sex start and watch the partner of the 1AC just stand and be like, I don't know, my partner's like totally going to answer that. Lame. Get your stuff together, people. You got to know it in and out. You know it better than anybody else. Don't answer, as a 1AC, don't answer questions that they don't ask. That's a good rule of thumb. And there. And also, case, clarity, persuasion. Just remember that all these things matter to you overall. They matter to your speaker points, they matter to a judge, and they matter to making people want to win. Because one of the things you learn in debate is it's not always about just being right. It's about being likable and compelling. Those things kind of matter. All right, so that's my quick and dirty 1AC. better. What?
For the format of 1AC, do you think there should be a specific solvency contention?
Yeah, usually. But solvency contentions by right tend to have like one of the parts where it says the action of the plan should be done, right? It describes why it might solve kind of a meta level. And a lot of the rest of it is sort of preemptive things that are common. Any other questions? Oh, the last thing I forgot to say, and Sarah reminded me of this just before I came down, is that be a good partner is the 1AC. One of your responsibilities is to backflow your partner. Flow the speech for yourself as detailed as you can, and while the 2AC is being processed, you got to use that 3 minutes to backflow the thing. Clearly. Legibly. Completely. So that they don't drop a bunch of arguments. But your 2AC, and obviously 2AC, and so I know, really relies on you to do these things. And when you fail at that responsibility, you put your team behind you from the very beginning. So be a good partner and do those kind of things. All right? Any other questions? Sorry, everyone.
Double up. It's actually 3 speeches. So we're going to hear now about policy 1NCs and how to construct them, etc. And Mustafa and Shrieker, if I had noticed that you were sitting next to each other, I would have moved you. So dig deep. Hunker down. Try not to talk to each other. I just called you out in front of everyone, okay?
She calling you out for donkey's bang.
Alright. Yeah. Okay, I'm going to talk to you about policy 1NCs. The first thing I'm going to say is I don't want to rehash what Scott just said, but I'm going to echo all of the research goals. Everything that you do to write a 1AC goes into preparing proper 1NCs throughout the entirety of the year. That discussion will probably be more important when we get to how to debate the negative block, but I will say beforehand, I'm going to talk about 5 main things. First is what I call early season research. All right, you're at debate camp now. The topic's been out for a long time. You know exactly what's going on. There are hundreds of different disadvantages, multiple different counterplans you could possibly write. In order to have successful 1NCs that set up the negative blocks and more importantly, the 2 and R that you can win, is that you decide early on in the season how you want to approach the 1NC. What I mean by this is there are what we call generic disadvantages and generic counterplans. These are arguments that just kind of go with the topic. For instance, as Scott said, a counterplan that you might encounter a lot is a state's counterplan. As a 1NC, you should know that you have a generic counterplan option. So you should take that file and get it ready for multiple different debates. The same is true of generic disadvantages. On this year's topic, fiscal discipline or spending. You should prepare that file. Complete the file to where you can read that against any act on the topic. So set up generic links in the file, set up impacts that will be separate from the case impacts, and most importantly, you need to set up a part of the file that says this ad turns the case. Reasons to why the disadvantage will come prior to the advantages to the affirmative. Those are things you need to do as a 1NC and a negative team prior to ever going to a tournament. You need to have 2 or 3 disadvantages, 1 or 2 counterplans that you can always trust. Those are generic arguments. The next thing you want to do as part of your early season research is find a part of the topic that you like a lot, that you really enjoy reading about, and as a negative team or as the 1NC, it's something that you know that every debate round, it's an argument you could go for. On this year's topic, there's going to be, I think, a pretty good China counterplan. That might be an area that you want to dig into about why the China counterplan can solve a host of different acts. So as a 1NC, you always want to make sure that you have generic arguments ready to go, and you're going to want to be able to make sure that you can craft a couple specific arguments that's literature basis that you can go deep in. Because as the 1NC, you also give the 1 and R, which is a shortened speech. You want to make sure the argument you choose for the 1 and R that the 2NC won't use is something you're familiar with. And you can do that by doing research early on in the season. The second thing, which is important when we talk about that research, is disclosure. In high school debate, just like in college debate, there are large wikis. There's a central database where schools all throughout the country disclose 1ACs that they're reading. There's also the NDCA, Open Evidence Project, where you can go and look at files that most every camp across the country has looked at. You want to know what people's affirmatives are. You need to create a master list of plan mechanisms, meaning these are plans that you'll hear a lot of. The second list you want to create is popular advantages. You need to know all of the advantages people are reading on the affirmative. The reason is because you have to create files to answer these arguments. As a 1NC, and in the 1NC, it's your responsibility to make sure you have evidence to answer every known argument. At tournaments, you don't want to show up and lose rounds to arguments you already know exist. Look, high-speed rail is going to be an affirmative. You should start right now preparing to debate high-speed rail. By that, you should already have, well, you're at camp right now. By the time the season rolls along, you should have a dedicated negative file to high-speed rail affirmatives. Within that file, you want to have subsections that have case advantages frontlined out. In your labs, you will be talking about how to frontline someone's advantage. Every common affirmative needs to have that done. If you know people read high-speed rail, and you know the most common 4 advantages, there's no reason for you not to do that work before you even go to the tournament. Do not be like, well, we have that somewhere. I know we have this in our tub or on our computers. You're the 1NC. Go ahead and put together a file on every single affirmative. If you debate in a place in the country where there are only like 25, 30 teams, then create individual files for each of those teams. Make debate easy prior to the tournament. And as the 1NC, you have infinite prep time to creating sustainable 1NC files for each argument and or each team. Preparation time for the 1NC is very important. How you make sure that preparation time works is to do disclosure research. Look at case books. Look at the NDCA for popular affirmatives that are being written at camps. And create front lines for those case advantages. So those are things that you can do prior to the tournament. Now I understand if you're the 1NC, you're probably also the 2AC. Hopefully none of you are doing double one. So your time trade-off, as Scott just lectured everything you should know about your app, you have to do affirmative research. Your job as the 1NC is not to create a bunch of new research when organizing all this stuff. It's just to create a list that then other negative workers can make sure that they do. But before you go to that tournament, you need to make sure you have all these things in a central location. Okay, the next place before you head to a tournament that you need to look in order to be a good 1NC is, for the most part, every tournament you go to will have registered entries. You can look online to see all of the other teams that are going to the tournament you're going to. Why is that useful? Because it allows you to predict with some accuracy the affirmatives that you'll hear at that tournament. When you go to a big tournament, there is no way to know who you will debate. So you have to first take the approach of, there are 50 teams. How can I narrow that down? The first way you narrow it down is you group it by affirmatives. High-speed rail, oil pipelines, Alaska, whatever the affirmative is, group them. From there, you can group it into advantages to make sure you're ready to debate each of those teams in the tournament. So that's the work we do prior to going to the tournament, to make sure that you're a good 1NC. And remember, you can't do all of this yourself. You have to work with people on your team. Not just your partner, but everyone else in order to have a controlled, central database of plan mechanisms and advantage areas. All right, so you've arrived at the tournament. Your job as a 1NC is not quite over. Depending on where you debate, there's certain disclosure policies or, there's norms to how people disclose. If you're the negative team and you're debating someone, you're negative, and the affirmative team is in the room, and it's prior to the debate, you should ask them questions. And as the 1NC, you should, if your 2NC is not, remind them to do so. The following questions are important. What is the affirmative? And what I mean mean by that is not just for them to be like, we read high-speed rail, and then you walk away. When you ask them what the affirmative is, you want to be able to see a copy of the plan, or have them tell you what the plan is. Next, you want to make sure you know what their advantages are. When you're like, hey, what's the advantage? If they're like, Russia, that's not enough. You need a follow-up question. All right, I get that it's Russia. What's the internal link, or what's the impact? Is it U.S.-Russian war? Is it Russian economy? Is it Russian terrorism? Is it accidental launch? You want to make sure that you can know those things before the debate even starts. And for the most part, disclosure norms are pretty, regular across the country, that the negative should be able to ask the affirmative what's going on. If you debated like Missouri or Kansas, I'm not sure how often you can do that, but if you're like in Texas, Oklahoma, California, New York, New Jersey, you could probably go ahead and ask, what's the affirmative, and they'll explain. And even if it's like not common, because you debate Missouri or Kansas, like Ashley does, you can still ask. It doesn't hurt. What are they going to say? No? You're like, okay. Right? So always ask. Always try to find out as much information as possible before the debate begins. Those questions are essential. Okay, so now we need to talk about, we have all that research, we know what the F is, how do we construct a 1NC? This is very important. Every argument, each off-case argument you want to read in the debate round needs to be in the first constructive speech. I understand that the 2NC is a constructive, but that is not a good time to read disads and counterplans or critiques. You need to read those in the 1NC. So the first part that goes in the construction of a good 1NC is the question of, how will we win the debate? That involves being able to be like, this is how we'll divide the block, and this is what the 2NR will go for. All of that starts with the 1NC. The 1NC needs to be designed to where you can say, there are 3 ways we can win this debate. You need 3 options built into the 1NC to win the debate. Whether it's disad counterplan, disad case, a T argument, 3 different options. Also, maybe it's a critique. RJ in a moment will talk about if the 1NC is only the K, and probably case debate as well. The K would be weird. It'd probably be like K in the case. But, minimal case, sorry. Minimal case. But, include those options in your 1NC. A good 1NC will have at least 3 options to win the debate at the end. The next question that we ask ourselves, after we've laid out those options, do we have a problem with those things conflicting with each other? If I read this disad, does it link to my counterpoint? And if so, does that mean I'm going to be in trouble later on in the debate round? We want to make sure we're not double turning ourselves as of the 1NC. Luckily, being negative, you're allowed to be conditional or have conditional arguments, so a lot of times that's not that relevant. But it's important to know which arguments you could go for at the end of the debate at the same time. Can I go for my cat K critique and the fiscal discipline disadded to 2NR? That's a question that you need to ask yourself. If you don't think so, know that immediately in the 1NC. Those are conversations that have to happen prior to the debate when outlining what the 1NC is. Okay, so good 1NC first has off case. When we say off case, you usually want a disad in there, maybe 2 disads, your pick. I, for the most part, think that it's good to have a topicality argument in the 1NC, especially if it's an act that you think is borderline topical. The reasons why we want to place topicality arguments in the 1NC is it requires the 2AC to spend time with. Now, if you just run like a T argument that's like substantial means 90%, the 2AC is probably not going to spend a lot of time. They're going to make the relevant arguments and move on. If they're reading a high-speed rail app and your T argument is about like energy for like oil pipelines, the 2AC is not going to spend a lot of time. So including a topicality argument needs to be a decision you make based upon the plan and your T violation. As the 1MC, you want to make sure that your T argument, each time you read it to a different 1AC, has a different violation / interpretation. You want to tailor it to the plan text of the 1AC. After we set up our T argument, we then make a decision. Do we want to read a counterplan? The answer should always be yes. Counterplans are good ideas. They will talk to you about critiques in a second. They're more knowledgeable about that. I'm only talking about counterplans. This does not contradict what RJ will say in a little bit, or when the people speak in the block. But if you're a policy debater, counterplans are your best friend. You need to decide which counterplan you'd like to read. If you think you'd like to read a standard counterplan and an advantage counterplan, that is fine. 2 counterplans are legit. 3 counterplans are probably fine. I don't care if you want to read 9 counterplans. But the decision that you need to make in the 1NC is, can I defend the theoretical legitimacy of 1 or more counterplans? Can I defend 2 or more? You have to decide that before the debate. The second thing about deciding to read a counterplan is you have to have the 1AC plan text. Never write your counterplan text without knowing what the 1AC plan text is. Without looking at the 1AC plan text and writing out the counterplan. So many times, sloppy 1NCs or sloppy negative teams try to read the same counterplan text over and over to a different affirmatives. The problem with that is you give the 2AC easy chances to win on the permutation debate. You have to tailor your counterplan text to the plan text. Especially if it's a plan-inclusive counterplan, which you all call PICs, right? You would have to know exactly what part of the plan you're doing and what part you're not doing. A general rule of thumb is that a counterplan text should mirror as closely as possible the affirmative plan. You should attempt to do everything the affirmative does except for the part you're picking out of. If it's an advantage counterplan, it's a lot different because then you're just attempting to solve an advantage. But always use the 1AC plan text as the starting point for your counterplan text. Next thing is a 1NC on counterplans. Once you have written out the counterplan text, say this. Yo, partner, will you read this and tell me if you see any mistakes? Always ask the 2NC about the counterplan text. The 2NCs that go to write it, and you are, make sure they look it over. 2 sets of eyes is better than 1. Sometimes in the hurry of a debate round, you're writing things down and you might miss a word, or typing them, whatever you're doing. Have the other person look at it. Within the off-case stuff, we have disadvantages. Your decision to read disads, whether it's 1 or 3, whatever you want to do. When looking at off-case and deciding how many counterplans, how many disads, what T argument, if I'm going to read the K, all of this is based in how the block will execute that strategy. The second thing is, you should read as much off-case as you want, as long as it's strategic. And it is never strategic for the entire 1NC to be off-case positions. You have to read arguments to people's advantages. So the next job of the 1NC is once they've decided on what arguments will be off-case, is to make sure each case advantage is answered. At a minimum, when we're, as 1NC is answering case advantages, there has to be terminal impact defense. For every impact the 1AC reads, your job as a 1NC should read a defense card to that terminal plane. If they say US-Russian war, you need to read evidence that says US and Russia won't go to war. you have to read terminal impact defense. The second necessary thing is internal link defense. If they say building high-speed rail cuts down on the amount of people that drive, you need to read arguments that say people will drive regardless of high-speed rail. That answers the internal link part of their advantage. Terminal impact defense, internal link defense. Those are your two things that have to be in there for 1 and C. Your next argument that you can include is your offense, your case turn arguments. So as you sat there before the debates even began with your partner, crafting out your off case and case arguments, before you're like, okay, we're ready to begin this debate, give the 1 and C, that's when you have to say to yourself, can I read all of this in 8 minutes? And the only way that you'll be able to know that is if you have practiced before the tournament in reading your off-case positions. Just as Scott said, reading the 1AC is really important. Practice reading your common 1 and C arguments is super important. That way, within each word file, you can put on the top of the 1 and C, right when it says, Obama good, 1 and C, dash, however long it takes you to read that shell. So when you're compiling each of the arguments, you will know how long it takes you to read that dissat, that T argument, that counterpoint. That way, you'll know how much case you can fill in. Next thing, whenever you stand up to give the 1 and C, always bring with you additional case cards. You never want to get done reading and your partner be like, minute and a half, and you're like, I'm out of cards. Perceptually, to the judge, it makes it look like you're not as prepared. Also, it wastes critical time that you could have been reading evidence for your partner to find more evidence for you to read. Third, every time your partner has to do things to find you more cards to read the 1 and C, it cuts down on the amount of quality prep time they're using. Normally, as a 2 and C, when you're listening to the 1 and C, as a nice partner, you backflow for the 1 and C, if they haven't done that prior to the debate. Second, you begin prepping your 2 and C, writing the overviews, writing why dissat turns the case. So you don't want to have to like pull a bunch of cards and hand off to the 1 and C. So always bring with you extra cards. So that's how you approach the 1 and C as if you already know what's going to happen. You want to make sure you have the off-case positions you want. You want to make sure that you're covered on each advantage. You never want to sit down after giving the 1 and C and be like, whoa, we didn't even read any arguments to their advantage. If they read 3 advantages, don't be like, well, I'll answer 2, that should be sufficient, right? Because that third advantage, especially if your counterpoint doesn't solve it, it's not going to be a good idea. That's the generic way to approach the 1 and C. There are some specific things, though, that change. If your approach of the 1 and C is like, look, we want to impact turn certain parts of the act, that changes how you structure the off-case position. If you're going to impact turn their economy advantage and say that economic decline is good, you better make sure you're not reading a spending dissent or a fiscal restraint dissent. If you're going to impact turn their warming argument, make sure that your dissat that you've read about airlines trade-offs doesn't impact warming as well. Always be cognizant of how your impact turns interplay with your own arguments. The worst way to lose a debate is after you give the 1 and C, the 2AC stands up and points out a double turn that you can't get out of. The debate is over before it's even begun. And that happened because you were sloppy in your prep time prior to the 1 and C. So always double check what each argument will be, and if it has any interaction with another argument. So that's if your impact turn strategy, however you want to do it, you want to make sure that it is okay with your counterplan and disad strategy. Third thing about the 1AC or third scenario, a lot of times you'll go to a tournament and you'll ask someone, what's the affirmative? And they say new. When they say new, say, that's cool, but you should ask one additional question. Maybe more, but at a minimum this question. Are the advantages new? Just because someone says that the app is new, okay, that could mean that they've just changed the plan text somehow. So you should ask about the advantages. Are these advantages the same as to your old app? They say yes or no, ask another question. Is the plan new or is it just a modification? Remember, asking questions is a totally fair game. Debate is a game about, it's an educational activity. It's a game. The affirmative and negative both have means or disclosure norms. Just ask questions. Every school is a little bit different, but for the most part, people agree that if you've read the plan before, you will say what the plan is. If you've read the advantage before, you will tell them the advantage. Oftentimes, people will change the plan, but the advantages might be the same. So always ask about that. The other thing that you can ask if you want, that our debaters ask a lot of, and I think it's important, is if they say new, be like, is this an affirmative that someone else on your team has ran before? They can choose to answer that or not. But for the most part, people are pretty nice. They're not going to game the system. Disclosure is a norm. It's an educational part of our activity. So once you've had the very important discussion about whether or not the app is new, you have to prep for that. You don't just say, oh, they're reading a new app. Let's go out in the hall and talk to our friends. You begin prepping. How do you do this? Well, you can base your decision on apps that school has read in the past on that topic, or apps similar to the one they've read. How could they change it a little bit? You can get ready for everything you know that their school is currently doing. Second thing about a new app, always get your generic arguments ready. If you debate the politics dissent, and you should all the time, it is a great TA. It's easy to stay on top of. Everyone believes there's usually a link. You can win there's a link. Judges are like, yeah, it's politics, whatever. Get your politics dissent ready. Get all of your generic link stuff ready to go. Third, make a decision. If it's a new app and you know you're not going to have good defense to their internal link, be like, we are good to go on these 4 different impact turn strategies. Pick one of them and do it. Scott told you earlier that never read an impact to a 1AC that you're not ready to defend. That could not be more true. In 2008, the quarterfinals of the National Debate Tournament, a team that I was coaching debated the #1 seed at the tournament. They said new app. We got everything ready. One of their advantages was NATO good. We had talked all before the tournament, if someone broke a new app on us, our different impact turn strategies. One of them was NATO bad. They said NATO good, we said NATO bad. They had 0 answers. They had 2 cards. Their original 1AC impact card and 1 additional card to why NATO was good. The debate was over. Never read a 1AC, you can't defend an advantage. And as a 1NC, and as a negative team, pick 2 or 3 different impact areas that you want to impact turn and know them really well. If it's hegemony, understand the sustainability debate.